Let us get into our time machine, ladies and gentlemen, and take two little jumps of 150 or 200 years to arrive at the 16th century. In the 16th century, there was a new thriving power, Spain, or better yet, as Menéndez Pelayo would have said, Las Españas, the Spanish realms. The conquest of the Americas brought a huge influx of precious metals. We will not enter into whether or not they were stolen. Most of them were. They were the products of plunder. And we will not enter into a comparison between the Spanish model of colonization and the Portuguese model of colonization. The Portuguese model was much more commercial and less violent, so to speak. In any case, the focus of the European trading world shifted from the Italian cities to Spain, specifically Seville, which somehow monopolized the arrival of those precious metals through its Casa de Contratación, or trading house. Thus, it is not surprising that the leading bankers moved their business to Seville, or emerged there. In his research, Ramón Carande discovered, in the documents of Seville's trading house, a list of bankrupt bankers. And this discovery enabled him to complete his great work, entitled Charles V and His Bankers. It was truly fortunate that he uncovered this list of bankers, which was compiled prior to the confiscation of precious metals in the year 1545. Well, there was an explosive combination there. There were the private bankers who received on deposit the precious metals that had come from the Americas and belonged to individual traders. As you know, a portion was for the crown, but another portion was for the discoverers, traders, ship owners, etc. And they deposited it in the banks. And, as always, private bankers acted more or less honestly in the beginning and maintained the tantundum. But soon they began to give in to the temptation to appropriate a substantial portion for their own business dealings related to trade. The outfitting of ships for trade with the Americas, insurance, etc. But in addition, the Spanish public treasury was continually out of balance, to put it gently. Charles V launched some absolutely disproportionate projects, aimed initially at gaining the empire, for which he needed to pay out. It was necessary for him to somehow pay his electors, and to do so, he indebted himself to the bankers up to his eyeballs, apart from all of his wild imperial projects in Europe. He arrived in Spain a foreigner, and in the end he became more Catholic than the Pope, and he involved the Spanish in costs, disproportionate public expenditures that reduced the country to constant long-term poverty. And when he had no other possibility, he resorted to appropriating money wherever it was. And where was it? Well, it was deposited in the bank's accounts, in the Sevillian bankers' vaults. And what would Charles V do? Well, he would arrive, confiscate the gold, and leave a paper which said, compulsory loan to the crown at X%, 4, 5, 6% interest. That is why I say there was an explosive combination. If private bankers were already tempted to appropriate part of the money on demand deposit for their own business dealings, and experience taught them that every X amount of time the king's officials or representatives showed up, took away the deposited money, which belonged to the depositors, and left in exchange a paper declaring the money had been turned into a forced loan to the crown, the result is obvious. Before the king's officials come and take my customers' money, I will take it myself. Thus, fractional reserve banking went through a process of development in Seville, and in the initial stage, as always, it triggered a process of credit expansion, the creation of means of payment from nothing, which we will examine closely in Chapter 4. In the beginning, for a few years, this process gave rise to tremendous artificial euphoria, which coincided with the boom created by the influx of precious metals into Spain. Listen, monetary growth is a poisoned chalice. To a large extent, the reason Spain fell into serious economic decline, which it did not reverse until practically yesterday, was the terrible damage caused by this monetary growth. Since precious metals were already streaming into Spain, this growth had a huge impact on Spanish prices, which rose dramatically due to the devaluation of the monetary unit, or the drop in its purchasing power, which accompanied the dramatic increase in the money supply. According to Hamilton, in the course of a century, the quantity of money, in terms of gold and silver, doubled. From today's perspective, that inflation was child's play, but from the perspective of the time, it was hugely distorting. Since prices rose so much in Spain, it was not worthwhile to buy products from the Iberian Peninsula. It was much cheaper and more competitive to buy them elsewhere. Consequently, Spanish businesses and companies were devastated. They were not profitable. Anyone who wanted to start a business found he could not compete with the cloth from Flanders, nor with the weapons imported from France and Italy, etc. And in the end, well, the Spanish were ruined. There were only three places to turn for employment: the church, the sea, or the crown. A man could become a priest, or he could go to sea. What did it mean to work at sea? It meant crossing the Atlantic to try one's luck in the Americas. Or a man could serve the king in the military. But did anyone think of making an effort to save and to undertake a business activity? No. Such activities were socially undervalued and suitable only for Jews, Muslim converts to Christianity, and foreigners. No one wanted to get his hands dirty by becoming an entrepreneur. It should not surprise us that Spain was ruined and became a wasteland. The shame, the poverty that has afflicted Spain until just 25 years ago. And we are still strongly influenced by this philosophy of bankrupt young gentlemen and hidalgos who want to know nothing about the business world. Fortunately, the new generations of vigorous young people are changing the mindset. They are valuing the entrepreneurial spirit more and more, and they no longer simply want to become civil servants. What do you want to be? I want to be a civil servant. How pitiful. The poor thing. And you are hearing this from me, a level 29 civil servant. Well, as we will see, theory explains that when, in the Spain of the Golden Age, a speculative bubble formed due to credit expansion brought about by fractional reserve banking, the real economy was influenced, and the effect was aggravated by the tremendous impact which the influx of precious metals had on prices. In other words, this impact was also greatly increased by the exercise of fractional reserve banking. And sooner or later, the process reversed in the form first of a financial crisis and then of an economic recession. Well, the work of Ramon Carande provides documentary evidence that nearly all the banks in Seville failed. He has documentation, and he examines the business history of bankers like Cristobal Franciscan, Diego Martinez, Juan Iñiguez, and Octavio de Negron, all of whom failed. The Bank of the Espinosas, who were also very prominent bankers, failed in the year 1579. All of the partners ended up in prison. Domingo de Lazaridis went bankrupt in 1553, when he was unable to make a payment of more than 6.5 million maravedis that had been placed on demand deposit with him. The Bank of Pedro de Morga, which began to operate in 1553, failed 22 years later, during the second bankruptcy of Philip II. It is exciting to read Ramon Carande's work, to learn about all the bankers he studies, find out about their vicissitudes, and see how they were all devastated in the economic and financial crisis of the second half of the 16th century. There was a comment made by Thomas Gresham, who travelled to Seville with some promissory notes to withdraw some money, and Gresham, who later became very famous. Gresham's law, bad money drives out good. We will talk about that in the future. It is a typical case of setting maximum prices. Anyway, Gresham complained. He said, "Truly, if I take this money out of Seville, with the promissory notes I have, I am sure all the banks in Seville will suspend payments." And Gresham was astonished, because Seville was the most important financial center in the world. Seville was like New York, like Wall Street today. He said, "If I withdraw this money, Wall Street will collapse." And sure enough, just like Wall Street, which did recently collapse, Seville was ruined.